You think no contact is what hurts an avoidant. You think silence, distance, and disappearing will finally make them realize what they lost. But here's the truth most people never understand. Avoidants don't break because of absence. They adapt to it. What actually shakes them is something completely different, something they can't control, avoid, or rationalize. And once it happens, their emotional walls don't just crack. They start to question everything they believed about love, closeness, and even themselves. Stay with me because this changes how you understand avoidant behavior forever. Avoidant individuals don't respond to emotional distance in the same way that anxious or more emotionally dependent attachment styles do. In fact, one of the most misunderstood aspects of avoidant psychology is that distance is not experienced as loss. At first, it is often experienced as relief. When a relationship becomes emotionally intense, demanding, or highly expressive, an avoidant nervous system can feel overwhelmed. So, when separation or no contact happens, instead of immediately feeling panic or longing, there is often a sense of space, quiet, and regained control over their emotion. A environment. This is not because they do not care or feel nothing. It is because their emotional system is trained to regulate closeness by creating distance. Okay? Many avoidant individuals learned early in life that emotional expression was either not consistently met, was discouraged, or felt unsafe in some way. As a result, they developed a coping strategy: rely on themselves first, suppress emotional needs, and reduce dependency on others. Over time, this becomes automatic, so when someone pulls away, their internal system doesn't interpret it as an emergency right away. It interprets it as a return to equilibrium. This is where most people misunderstand no-contact strategies. They assume that silence will immediately create emotional pressure in the avoidant person. But, in reality, the avoidant mind is often structured around emotional self-containment. They are used to processing feelings internally, delaying emotional responses, or even compartmentalizing them entirely. So when contact is removed, the initial psychological response is not "I miss them desperately," but rather "things are calmer now." That calmness can be misleading because it is not the absence of emotion, but the absence of emotional activation triggers. However, this does not mean avoidants are unaffected. It means their emotional processing is delayed and indirect. While they may appear fine on the surface, their subconscious mind continues to register changes in relational dynamics over time. The absence of pressure allows them to restabilize, but it also removes the emotional stimulation that kept the relationship cognitively present. In simple terms, they stop feeling pushed, but they also stop being emotionally activated by the relationship in an immediate way. Another important factor is that avoidants are highly sensitive to perceived demands on their autonomy. When closeness increases, they may feel a subtle internal pressure, even if the relationship is healthy. That pressure can create withdrawal behavior not because they dislike the person, but because their nervous system equates emotional closeness with potential loss of independence. So when no contact begins, that pressure disappears. And when pressure disappears, the avoidant system naturally relaxes. This is why many people feel confused when they implement distance, expecting an immediate emotional reaction. Instead of chasing, the avoidant may appear indifferent or even more settled. This creates an illusion that they do not care, when in reality they are simply no longer activated. Emotional activation in avoidance often comes later, not during the peak of separation, but during moments of reflection, memory association, or when they encounter emotional contrasts such as seeing the person move on, change, or emotionally detach in a stable way. Over time, the brain of an avoidant can begin to register absence differently. Once the nervous system is no longer in relief mode, it may start to process what was lost in terms of emotional connection, familiarity, and stability. But this process is not linear or guaranteed. It depends on the depth of attachment, emotional maturity, and whether the relationship created meaningful internal significance beyond just comfort or routine. What is often overlooked is that avoidants are not unaffected by attachment. They are just slower to emotionally integrate it. Their system prioritizes self-regulation over emotional expression. So instead of reacting immediately to absence, they process it in fragments, a memory here, a thought there, a sudden, an emotional wave that they may not fully understand or act upon. In essence, no contact does not break or instantly change an avoidant. It removes the emotional activation loop they were used to, and in that space of calm, their system resets to its baseline of independence and self-reliance. Only later, if emotional significance was strong enough, does reflection begin to replace relief. When you look deeper into avoidant psychology, one of the most important truths is that their fear is not centered around losing a specific person in the immediate emotional sense. It is not the same kind of fear that anxious individuals experience where separation feels like abandonment or emotional collapse. Instead, the core fear in avoidant attachment is much more internal and identity-based. It is the fear of losing control over their own emotional world, autonomy, and sense of self-direction. To understand this, you have to see how an avoidant mind organizes relationships. For them, closeness is not automatically safe or comforting. It is something that slowly increases emotional demands, expectations, and vulnerability. Even in healthy relationships, there is often a subtle internal pressure they feel when emotional intensity. It is not always conscious, but it manifests as discomfort, withdrawal, or the need to create space. This is not because they do not value connection, but because connection activates a deep sensitivity around dependence and emotional exposure. So, when a relationship starts to feel too close or emotionally intense, the avoidance system begins to prioritize control over the situation. Control in this context does not mean manipulation in a negative sense. It means emotional self-regulation, keeping feelings contained, predictable, and manageable. The avoidant person learns early on that if they rely too much on others, they risk emotional instability. So, they develop a strong internal rule: stay in control, stay self-sufficient, don't become emotionally overwhelmed. This is where the misunderstanding often happens. People assume avoidance fear intimacy itself, but that is not entirely accurate. What they fear is what intimacy might do to their sense of control. Emotional closeness can feel like losing boundaries, losing predictability, and losing the ability to easily regulate their emotional state. When someone becomes emotionally important, to them they feel a strong connection and attachment. It also creates emotional responsibility, and that responsibility can feel heavy for a nervous system that is wired to self-protect through distance. Now, when no contact or emotional withdrawal happens, people often think it is the ultimate punishment for an avoidant. But from their perspective, the immediate effect is not loss, it is restoration of control. The emotional space gives them back their internal balance. They are no longer managing emotional expectations, no longer processing relational pressure, and no longer feeling the subtle demands that closeness creates. In that state, they feel more in control of themselves again. But here is the deeper layer most people miss. Control is not the same as indifference. An avoidant may feel calmer without contact, but that calmness is about regulation, not emotional absence. They are stabilizing, not disconnecting from meaning. However, because their system prioritizes stability, they often misinterpret emotional relief as emotional resolution. In other words, if they feel okay, they assume there is nothing unresolved. This is one of the key psychological distortions in avoidant processing. What makes this even more complex is that avoidants often equate emotional intensity with loss of control. So, when a relationship becomes emotionally charged, arguments occur, demands for reassurance or emotional chasing, their system experiences that as a threat to autonomy. As a result, they pull back to regain control. But once control is restored, the emotional intensity disappears, and so does the immediate motivation to engage. This cycle creates a pattern where closeness leads to withdrawal, and withdrawal leads to temporary stability. However, long-term emotional impact is a different story. While avoidants prioritize control in the moment, emotional significance does not vanish simply because they feel regulated. It gets stored in the background. Memories, attachment bonds, and emotional associations remain even if they are not actively processed. Over time, if the emotional connection was meaningful, the absence of that connection can begin to surface in subtle ways, not as panic but as reflection, curiosity, or emotional comparison. The key idea here is that avoidants are not primarily driven by loss-based thinking. They are driven by regulation-based thinking. So, when you remove yourself, their first internal response is not "I lost someone important," but rather "I have regained emotional space." That distinction is critical. It explains why chasing or emotional pressure often pushes them further away, because it threatens the very thing they are trying to maintain: control over their internal state. In simple terms, you are not competing with their feelings in the beginning. You are competing with their need for emotional self-management. And until that system is stable, emotional longing does not fully take priority. The most powerful shift in avoidance psychology does not come from chasing, arguing, or creating emotional intensity. It comes from something far quieter but far more destabilizing to their internal system: emotional detachment combined with self-respect. This combination is what disrupts their usual expectations of relationships because it removes the emotional fuel they are used to responding to, while also removing the predictable patterns they rely on to stay regulated. To understand why this matters, you first need to understand how avoidants typically experience emotional dynamics in relationships. Many avoidant individuals are used to a certain rhythm. Closeness increases, emotional expectations rise. They feel internal pressure, and then they create distance to reset. This cycle is familiar to them, even if it feels uncomfortable at times. It is predictable. Predictability is important because it allows them to maintain a sense of emotional control. They may withdraw, but they usually expect the other person to react, to chase, to question, to express frustration, or to seek reassurance. That reaction confirms the emotional system they are used to. One person pursues, the other retreats. When you introduce emotional detachment with self-respect, that entire system stops functioning the way they expect. Emotional detachment does not mean coldness or revenge. It means you stop feeding emotional chaos into the dynamic. You stop over-explaining, stop chasing clarity from someone who is not offering it, and stop reacting impulsively to distance. At the same time, self-respect ensures that your behavior is grounded, not emotional manipulation or silent punishment. It is a calm, steady withdrawal of emotional investment without hostility. This combination creates a psychological interaction. Upcoming, the avoidant mind is no longer receiving the familiar signals it is used to interpreting. There is no emotional pressure to push against, no emotional chase to regulate, and no dramatic reaction to justify withdrawal. Instead, there is something unexpected: emotional neutrality. Neutrality is where confusion begins. Avoidants are often more comfortable with emotional extremes than with emotional neutrality. Intensity, even if uncomfortable, is predictable. But calm detachment without emotional pursuit removes their usual reference points. They cannot easily categorize it as "they are upset," "they are chasing," or "they are giving me space temporarily." It does not fit into their familiar relational scripts. What makes this even more impactful is that emotional detachment with self-respect sends a subtle but powerful message. Access to you is no longer automatic. In many avoidant dynamics, emotional connection becomes something they can step in and out of without consequence. The other person often remains emotionally available even when the avoidant withdraws. But when that availability disappears in a stable, grounded way, the dynamic changes. The relationship is no longer held together by one-sided emotional investment. This is where internal recalibration begins. The avoidance system starts to register that the emotional environment has changed, not because they are being punished, but because the emotional structure they were used to is no longer present. They no longer have the same emotional control over the dynamic. They cannot rely on distance being met with pursuit. They cannot assume emotional access will remain unchanged, regardless of their behavior. However, it is important to understand what this does and does not mean. Emotional detachment does not instantly create longing or emotional collapse in an avoidant person. That is a misunderstanding. What it does is create cognitive dissonance. The mind begins to process a gap between expectation and reality. They expected emotional reactions, instead they receive consistency. They expected pursuit, instead they observed self-contained behavior. This mismatch forces observation. Over time, observation replaces assumption. Avoidants are often slow to emotionally process relationships because they rely heavily on behavioral cues rather than emotional expression. When those cues change, they begin to assess the dynamic. They may not immediately show it, and they may even appear more distant at first, but internally the system is adjusting to a new relational pattern. Self-respect is the element that stabilizes this shift. Without self-respect, emotional detachment can turn into passive aggression, emotional games, or inconsistent behavior. Avoidants are highly sensitive to inconsistency because it reinforces their belief that closeness is unstable. But when detachment is paired with self-respect, the energy is different. It is not reactive, it is grounded. It communicates that emotional access is not something that can be taken for granted, but also not something that is being used as leverage. This is where the deeper psychological impact emerges. Avoidants are not just responding to absence, they're responding to changed relational value perception. When someone no longer reacts in predictable emotional patterns, the avoidant mind begins to reassess how secure or meaningful that connection actually is. Not in an immediate emotional flood, but in slow, reflective processing. The key transformation here is not emotional punishment or ego damage. It is disruption of emotional predictability, and for avoidance, predictability is what keeps distance comfortable. When predictability is removed through calm detachment and self-respect, the dynamic can no longer function on autopilot. It requires conscious evaluation, and that is where deeper emotional awareness can begin to surface over time. Avoidant individuals are often misunderstood as people who do not care, detach, or do not seek connection. But in reality, their emotional system is not disconnected. It is selective and highly regulated, okay? One of the most overlooked truths about avoidant psychology is that they are not driven by emotional pursuit in the same way as more expressive attachment styles. Instead, they are driven by something far more cognitive and controlled: clarity. Clarity for an avoidant means understanding what something is, where it stands, and how much emotional demand it will require from them. Unlike anxious attachment styles, which often prioritize emotional reassurance and connection signals, avoidants prioritize predictability and definition. If something feels emotionally ambiguous, unstable, or constantly shifting, it creates internal discomfort. Not necessarily because they feel intense emotional fear, but because ambiguity removes their sense of control over how they should respond. This is why avoidants often withdraw during emotional intensity. It is not always because they are indifferent, but because emotional intensity often comes without clarity. When emotions are high, expectations become unclear. What does the other person want right now? How much emotional response is required? What level of commitment is being implied? For someone with avoidant tendencies, these questions can feel mentally taxing. So instead of engaging in emotional escalation, they step back to regain clarity first. Okay, when no contact or emotional distance occurs, many people assume the avoidant will immediately feel loss and begin chasing emotionally. But what actually happens first is analysis, not emotion. The avoidant mind begins to observe the situation from a distance, trying to understand what has changed in terms of structure and meaning. They may ask themselves internal questions like, is this permanent? Is this temporary? What led to this shift? Is there still emotional access available? These are not emotional questions, they are cognitive ones. That is where the idea of chasing emotion becomes inaccurate. Avoidants are not typically driven to chase emotional intensity itself. In fact, emotional intensity can often be what they are trying to regulate away from. What they may chase, if anything at all, is clarity about the emotional landscape. They want to know whether the connection still exists in a defined form, whether expectations have changed, or whether the dynamic has become something they need to reevaluate. This distinction is extremely important. If someone tries to provoke an emotional reaction from an avoidant through pressure, then the person is not in a position to feel an emotional reaction from the other person. Silence games or emotional extremes, it often does not produce the desired result. Instead of creating longing, it often increases confusion or withdrawal because emotional chaos reduces clarity. Okay, and when clarity is reduced, avoidants typically respond by creating more distance, not less. On the other hand, when emotional dynamics become calm, stable, and predictable, even in absence, something different happens internally. The avoidance system begins to reevaluate without emotional overload. They are not reacting to intensity, they are observing consistency. And consistency is what allows them to process emotional meaning without feeling overwhelmed. This is why emotional detachment that is stable rather than reactive can have a stronger long-term impact than emotional pursuit. It removes chaos from the equation, allowing the avoidant mind to actually interpret the situation instead of escaping it. But even in this state, the process is not driven by immediate emotional longing. It is driven by understanding. Another key factor is that avoidants often associate emotional clarity with safety. When they know where they stand, how much is expected of them, and what the emotional structure looks like, they feel more in control of their responses. But when clarity is removed, for example, when someone becomes unpredictable, emotionally reactive, or inconsistent, their system may shift into protective distancing. Interestingly, this means that avoidants can sometimes appear more engaged when they feel emotionally safe in terms of clarity, even if emotional intensity is lower. They are more likely to stay present in relationships where expectations are clear, communication is direct, and emotional demands are not overwhelming. However, this presence should not be "I was mistaken for emotional chasing." It is comfort within structure, not pursuit of emotional depth. Over time, if emotional clarity is maintained, but emotional significance existed in the relationship, reflection can begin. This is where avoidants may start to revisit emotional memories or reassess the meaning of the connection. But even then, the driving force is not emotional urgency. It is cognitive processing. They are trying to understand what the relationship meant, what changed, and whether reconnection makes sense within their internal framework. In essence, avoidants are not emotionally driven explorers. They are structured processors. They move toward understanding before they move toward feeling. And if understanding is not available, they default to distance until clarity can be restored. This is why emotional pressure rarely works long-term with avoidant individuals. While stable, grounded behavior tends to create more internal reflection over time. The most important takeaway is this: avoidants do not chase emotional chaos, but they do engage with emotional clarity. And what often looks like emotional indifference is actually a system waiting for enough stability to interpret what the connection truly means without feeling overwhelmed by it. One of the most subtle but powerful shifts in avoidant psychology happens when you stop becoming emotionally predictable. Avoidant individuals are highly attuned to patterns in relationships, not necessarily through conscious analysis, but through behavioral expectation. Over time, they learn how people usually respond to them. If they withdraw, the other person pursues. If they become distant, the other person seeks reassurance. If they remain silent, the other person fills the gap with emotional energy. This creates a predictable emotional ecosystem where, even if the relationship is unstable, the reactions within it are familiar. Predictability is important because it reduces cognitive load. For an avoidant, predictable emotional responses from others allow them to navigate closeness without fully engaging in emotional vulnerability. They can step forward and back, regulate intensity, and maintain a sense of control because they already know how the other person will respond. Sure, in a way, predictability becomes a stabilizing mechanism for them, even if the relationship itself is emotionally inconsistent. When you remain emotionally predictable, you unconsciously reinforce their internal model of relationships. That emotional distance will be met with emotional pursuit. This creates a cycle where they can withdraw without fully risking emotional loss because they trust the pattern will restore itself. Even when they pull away, they assume connection will still be available in the same way it always has been. This is why many avoidant dynamics feel like a loop: closeness, distance, return, repeating over and over. However, something fundamentally shifts when you stop participating in that predictable pattern. When you no longer chase after withdrawal, when you no longer over-explain silence, and when your emotional responses become stable rather than reactive, the familiar system breaks. Suddenly, the avoidant no longer receives the expected feedback from their behavior. Their withdrawal no longer triggers immediate pursuit. Their silence is no longer filled with emotional noise from the other side. This disruption is not immediately processed as emotional loss. Instead, it is processed as pattern interruption. The avoidant mind begins to register that something in the relational state, rupture, has changed, not in an emotional panic way, but in a cognitive observation. The usual response is missing. And when the usual response is missing, the internal system can no longer rely on automatic assumptions about how the relationship functions. At first, this can create a form of psychological recalibration. The avoidant may test the pattern. They may withdraw slightly to see if pursuit returns. They may become more distant to observe whether emotional reaction is triggered. This is not always conscious manipulation. It is often subconscious pattern testing. The mind is trying to verify whether the old relational rules still apply. But when they consistently encounter a different response, calmness, neutrality, or grounded detachment, something deeper begins to shift. The emotional environment is no longer reactive, it is stable, and stability without predictability creates cognitive uncertainty. They can no longer rely on past experience to predict future emotional outcomes. This is where emotional awareness begins to develop, but not in a dramatic or immediate way. It begins through observation. They notice that emotional access is no longer automatic. They notice that their usual withdrawal does not create the same effect. They notice that the relationship is no longer operating on emotional push and pull dynamics. This forces them into a state of reflection rather than reaction. Okay, importantly, becoming not predictable does not mean becoming chaotic or emotionally inconsistent. In fact, emotional chaos often pushes avoidance further away because it confirms their belief that emotional closeness is unstable. True disruption comes from calm consistency when your emotional state is no longer dependent on their behavior, when you are no longer easily triggered into pursuit, explanation, or emotional escalation. The entire relational script loses its power. This is also where emotional independence becomes psychologically significant. When you stop reacting in expected ways, you are no longer reinforcing their control over the emotional rhythm of the relationship. You are no longer an emotional extension of their behavior. Instead, you become a separate emotional system, stable, self-contained, and not easily influenced by distance or silence. Over time, this creates a form of internal recalibration in the avoidant mind. They begin to reassess not just the relationship, but their assumptions about how relationships function with you specifically. The absence of predictable emotional feedback forces them to engage with uncertainty. And for avoidance, uncertainty is far more attention-grabbing than emotional intensity itself. However, this does not guarantee immediate reconnection or emotional expression. Avoidance may still maintain distance while processing this shift. What changes is not always behavior at first, but internal mapping. They begin to update their mental model of you from predictable emotional responder to emotionally self-regulated individual. This shift is crucial because it alters perceived relational access. When someone is emotionally predictable, access feels guaranteed. When someone becomes emotionally self-contained, access feels conditional, and conditional access requires thought, not assumption. In the end, the real impact of becoming unpredictable is not about forcing emotional reaction. It is about removing automaticity from the relationship. And once automatic emotional patterns are gone, everything that remains must be consciously evaluated rather than emotionally assumed. One of the most important misunderstandings about avoidant psychology is the belief that emotional change happens through punishment, pressure, or emotional intensity. In reality, avoidant individuals do not typically transform through emotional force. They transform, if they do, through emotional awareness that develops slowly when their nervous system is no longer overwhelmed. This is why real change does not come from trying to hurt, provoke, or emotionally shock them. It comes from something much quieter and far more psychologically mature. Emotional accountability without emotional chaos. To understand this, you have to first understand how avoidants process emotional discomfort. When emotional intensity rises in a relationship through conflict, demands, or emotional pursuit, their system often interprets it as overload. The immediate response is not reflection, but regulation through distance. They step back to regain internal stability. This is their primary coping mechanism. Reduce emotional stimulation to restore control. Because of this, high emotional intensity rarely leads to insight. Instead, it leads to withdrawal. So when people try to create change through emotional punishment, silence, CE used as manipulation, anger, emotional withdrawal, designed to teach a lesson, or dramatic exits, it often backfires. The avoidant does not interpret it as growth opportunity. They interpret it as confirmation that emotional closeness is unstable and unpredictable. This reinforces their existing defensive structure rather than weakening it. It strengthens the belief that emotional distance is safer than emotional engagement. Real change begins in a very different environment, emotional neutrality paired with consistency. Tasha. When the avoidant is no longer facing emotional chaos, accusations, or pressure to immediately respond, their nervous system is not in defense mode. And when the nervous system is not in defense mode, cognitive reflection becomes possible. This is the space where accountability can actually be processed. Emotional accountability in this context does not mean blame or punishment. It means allowing natural consequences of behavior to exist without distortion. For example, if someone repeatedly withdraws, avoids communication, or fails to meet emotional reciprocity, then the relationship is not healthy, and the other person calmly steps back instead of chases. That is accountability. There is no emotional escalation. There is just a clear, grounded response to behavior. This is important because avoidants are not blind to impact. They are often highly observant of relational dynamics, but they process them internally and gradually. When their behavior consistently results in loss of connection, reduced access, or changed emotional availability from the other person, and this is done without drama, it begins to register differently, not as emotional punishment, but as relational reality. Over time, this can lead to a deeper form of reflection. The avoidant may start to connect patterns. When I withdraw, the dynamic changes. When I stay distant, the connection weakens. When I avoid emotional responsibility, closeness reduces. This is not immediate emotional regret. It is cognitive pattern recognition. And this recognition is the foundation of any real internal shift. However, for this process to work, emotional stability from the other side is essential. If the response is chaotic, reactive, or emotionally inconsistent, the avoidant mind cannot clearly interpret the consequences of their actions. Instead, they focus on managing emotion, now turbulence, rather than understanding relational patterns. But when the response is calm, consistent, and self-respecting, the signal becomes clear. Behavior has consequences, and connection is not unconditional. This is where emotional maturity becomes more influential than emotional intensity. A calm response does not create emotional drama, but it creates clarity. And clarity is what avoidants actually engage with over time. They may not immediately express it, but clarity forces internal processing. It removes ambiguity and replaces emotional guessing with observable reality. Another critical aspect is that avoidants are often sensitive to authenticity, even if they do not openly respond to it. They can distinguish between emotional manipulation and grounded emotional boundaries. Tests. When someone is trying to provoke reaction, it often registers as pressure. But when someone simply stops overextending emotionally while remaining respectful, it registers as self-regulation. That difference is subtle but psychologically significant. In many cases, the turning point is not emotional confrontation but emotional absence of chaos. When the relationship no longer operates through cycles of pursuit and withdrawal, the avoidant is no longer able to remain in autopilot mode. They must either reflect or disengage more deeply. And if there is enough emotional significance underneath, reflection becomes more likely over time. It is also important to understand that this process does not guarantee reunion or emotional transformation in every case. Avoidants still have autonomy, life patterns, and individual differences in emotional capacity. But what this approach does is create the only environment where internal change is actually possible. One where emotional pressure is removed, but relational reality is still clearly communicated. Ultimately, real change in avoidant dynamics does not come from breaking someone emotionally. It comes from removing the emotional noise that prevents them from seeing themselves clearly in relationships. When emotional chaos is replaced with calm consequence, and when attachment is no longer reinforced through emotional chasing, attachment becomes a more stable and secure foundation for emotional well-being. Attachment becomes a more stable and secure foundation for emotional well-being. The avoidant is left with something they cannot easily escape: the reality of patterns, behavior, and outcomes. It is in that quiet space, not emotional intensity, where awareness slowly begins to form.